Good evening, everyone. I am Marcel Polednik, the Donna and Donald Baumgartner Director of the Milwaukee Art Museum. I join you this evening from the extraordinary Santiago Calatrava designed Quadracci Pavilion at the museum to celebrate the opening of the major exhibition that we've all been waiting for, Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, 1820 to 1920. The first exhibition of its kind that focuses on the impact of travel and Spanish art on America. It wouldn't be complete without a robust thank you to all of you, our members. You have been with us on an extraordinary journey these last 18 months, and we are so grateful for all of your support, which has made not only the last year and a half, but also the moment that we are experiencing today possible. I also wanted to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues at our co-organizing institution, the Chrysler Museum of Art, particularly their director, Eric Neal, who is joining us this evening. Welcome, Eric, and welcome to all of our Chrysler colleagues. Before we begin this program this evening, and I turn the reins over to Brandon Ruud, our Abert family Curator of American Art, I wanted to also thank all of our exhibition sponsors. This exhibition was made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. The Henry Luce Foundation is the national presenting sponsor. The exhibition is also supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities. Our supporting sponsors include the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum's American Art Society, and the Tourist Office of Spain in Chicago. Our contributing sponsors are Christie's and the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation. All exhibitions originally scheduled for 2020 at the Milwaukee Art Museum are made possible by the 2020 group of visionaries, whom include Donna and Donald Baumgartner, John and Murph Burke, Sheldon and Marianne Lubar, Joel and Karen Quadracci, Sue and Bud Seelig, and Jeff Yabuki and the Yabuki Family Foundation. Thank you to these generous sponsors and to the lenders to this exhibition. I also again want to say a heartfelt thanks to you, our members. As I mentioned, this has been an extraordinary journey, and not only have we learned a great deal, but we are now ushering in a new season of excitement that really begins with this exhibition. I hope you were able to come today and take part in the members' preview day at the museum. And if you've not yet had the opportunity, please know that for the next 2 weekends, you can come early as a member from 9 to 10 a.m. and enjoy the space with a little bit more arm's length and the ability to ponder in the galleries and really take a long and devoted look at each of the extraordinary works of art that we've brought here for your enjoyment. I hope you'll take advantage of that. And now, as we begin our evening, and it will be an extraordinary one, I will turn the program over to Brandon Ruud, who is in the galleries at the museum. He's also partnering tonight with his partner in crime for this exhibition, Corey Piper, the Brock Curator of American Art at the Chrysler Museum. Welcome, Corey. Brandon, take it away.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Like Marcel, I want to extend my thanks to the sponsors, donors, lenders for making this exhibition possible, for all of them, and you, our members, for joining us tonight. And a very special thanks to Rafaela Medina from the Florentine Opera for starting off tonight's event. Rafaela performed Sigidia from Bizet's Carmen. And in this aria, Carmen tries to seduce her captor, Don Jose, yes, so she can try to free herself and trick him into taking her to the inn of her friend. Thank you, Rafaela. And the painting that Rafaela performed in front of is perfectly appropriate to the subject of the opera and the aria. It is Walter Gay's 1895 painting, Cigarette Girls, Seville. And of course, Carmen and the beginning of the opera starts in a tobacco factory in Seville. The tobacco factory in Seville was one of the most popular tourist destinations in Spain in the 19th century, to the extent that the women who worked there were often referred to as Carmens in travelogues, guidebooks, and in newspaper articles. The subject of the painting, therefore, reinforces the ideas of the heroine of the opera, and you can see this in the details of the painting when you get a closer look here in the galleries. Of course, the story of Carmen inspired poetry, it inspired short stories, it inspired the opera, and it inspired painting. And speaking of inspiration, there are many people to thank for tonight's event, but I want to start with thanking one person in particular, and that is my partner, Greg Nosen. Not only are we celebrating the public opening of Americans in Spain tonight, but Greg and I are also celebrating our 18th anniversary. So thank you, Greg, and te amo. And in the spirit of love, let's go to Spain. If I seem a little flushed, it is indeed the flush of love. And I hope it is the exhibition and the paintings that you see here that you fall in love with when you visit the galleries. And the exhibition starts, as many trips to Spain do back then as now, in Madrid at the Prado Museum. The Prado was the premier destination like in the 19th century, whether you arrived initially by boat, by train, by carriage, all artists eventually made a pilgrimage to the Prado. And the copyist registers at the Prado are littered with the names of American artists of the first caliber: John Singer Sargent, Mary Cassatt, Robert Henry. All of them went to the Prado to study, to copy, to learn about the Spanish masterpieces housed there. And I'm standing in front of Bartolomé Esteban Murillo's painting, The Immaculate Conception of El Escorial. This was one of the premier paintings hanging in the Prado in the 19th century that many American artists visited and copied. Murillo was well known and respected, admired for his brushwork, his expressive use of color, his light touch. But this changed a little bit by the later half of the 19th century. Artists had other ideas in mind, and as Murillo fell out of favor, other artists took hold. So let's take a quick look at some of those examples. As the camera, I hope you had an opportunity to look at many of the paintings on view, because one of the wonderful things about the exhibition is to be able to play a who's who, not only of who painted that, but when. Is this a 17th century Velázquez masterpiece, or is this an American artist? And what you're seeing here is a monumental life-size painting of the Spanish Queen Mariana. And is it by Velázquez? Is it by an American artist? Of course, this is Robert Henry's copy of Velázquez's portrait of Queen Mariana. The portraits that Velázquez made of Mariana were among the most popular and frequently copied at the Prado Museum. And when Henry visited Madrid for the first time on his honeymoon in 1900, he exclaimed in a letter to his family that it was a wonderful thing, and it expressed every idea he wanted to capture or create as an artist. And this was the point for many people, many artists, for copying and why they went to the Prado and the whole purpose of artistic copies to begin with. Copying was a standard practice in the 19th, even up into the mid-20th century, for artists to learn their craft, to practice their creative expression, to learn about other artists and art history. And of course, as Robert Henry was developing his skills, he was looking at capturing nuances of expression. And portraiture became his primary reason for doing that. And so he turned to a painting like Mariana to copy because he could practice those skills. But why Velázquez at this point and not Murillo? Well, Velázquez by the late 19th century had become popular, especially with artists, because of the intense realism, the naturalism, the use of dark colors, but also that Velázquez himself was in a way kind of a precursor to the idea of the celebrity artist. And American artists could channel that idea into their own creation and their own personas. And with that, let's take another look at a painting. Many American artists who visited the Prado, yes, they made copies. And you'll see several examples when you go through the galleries of the exhibition, but they were not looking just to copy or imitate another artist. As mentioned, they were looking at ways of flexing their artistic muscle, of ways of creative expression. But they also took many of these copies home. They hung them in their studios. They used them as inspiration for future paintings, for future commissions. And this is really one such example. This is Thomas Eakins' portrait of James Carroll Beckwith, a fellow artist. And as you can see here, Beckwith is standing, he's got his palette and paintbrush in hand, and he is painting a portrait that you see on the easel there. It is a portrait of his wife. Beckwith himself was a devotee of Spanish art and culture. He had gone to Madrid, he had visited the Prado, he had made copies there himself, and he even famously took a journey that was reported on widely in the press with another group of artists across the sea to Europe, where they had Spanish-themed parties. They had Fortuny parties after the 19th century Spanish painter Mariano Fortuny. They even decorated the captain quarters and menus in Spanish themes. So it was appropriate that Eakins would immortalize Beckwith in a very Spanish way. Again, you will see that stark realism, the dark tones, the naturalism, but also the use of some bric-a-brac, and even as they're subdued, artistic objects either in the rug or in the framed painting in the background, or even the one that sits on Beckwith's easel. But most importantly, Beckwith himself is in the act of artistic creation, painting his wife. And this is reminiscent of Velázquez's famous painting, Las Meninas, of course, at the Prado, where the artist himself is seen at the canvas painting. So in this way, Eakins immortalized Beckwith, his love for Spanish art and culture, in the same way that the Spanish painter Velázquez immortalized his own self. Now, as we've been going through the galleries, if you've been admiring more than just the art on display, but the colors, the layout, the designs, the lighting. This is, of course, the result of many, many people here at the museum and their dedication and hard work. So for a behind-the-scenes look at how an exhibition like this comes together, let's go ahead and hear from some of them.
Hello, my name is David Rusick. I am the Director of Design here at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I've been asked to speak to you today about the experience of designing Americans in Spain. Exhibition design is one of my duties, probably my favorite. The whole experience starts with and revolves around the checklist, which once I get it from the curator, I tend to cut mine apart and lay it out in sections. So once we've considered the checklist and we've scaled the checklist, we can think about color. So you can see that one of the things that we try to do with the palette is we'll try to give you some variation. So here's the first section. Part of the reason that we chose these sepia tones is because we're going to have a lot of prints in that area, which are printed on beautiful buff paper, so they'll really be beautiful on the sepia tones. We move into the first section and we'll go to these wine tones. Those will give way to actually kind of a more neutral palette where we get into these gray tones, which will then warm up considerably in the following section where the exhibit turns and does a lot of landscape and goes outside, and we get this whole sort of sunlight and blue sky, the feeling of being outdoors, whereas all of this has been kind of very indoors. This is almost sort of cold. And then that gives way to these terracotta tones, which will warm up considerably, and that gives way to the coolness of modernism, where the show doesn't necessarily end, but it is part of the conclusion. To keep track of all the moving parts, I use two types of models: an analog, physical model, and a digital model. The physical model, as you can see, keeps track of everything all at once, and it's in scale, the walls to the floor to the checklist, the artwork. The digital model allows me to go down into the model, basically to shrink. But once I do, I can lose track of the greater whole. So for that reason, the two together are just incredibly powerful. So I hope you'll come to MAM and see Americans in Spain. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Art Mohagan. I'm the Chief Art Preparator at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Right now we're standing in the general operations area of the museum. This is where my team of 6 preparators build, construct, and prepare for exhibitions. So my team works closely with the exhibition design department. We'll get a design of our traveling exhibition gallery, and that'll display all of the 43 movable walls we have and how they need to be installed. The galleries take a lot of time to deconstruct the walls, match the walls together, mate the walls together, and then take raw materials and build in archways and headers that join the walls together and form unique passageways into these rooms. Here in the wood shop, we've got all of the casework and all of the crates that are built for the exhibition. We do that in-house. We have the loading dock where we unload all of the trucks and all of the crates from the exhibition, and then we store them in the vault, and then we have the installation up in the gallery where our team works with visiting couriers and visiting registrars to make sure that the work is in the right condition, but also mounted and installed with the curators and have the exhibition, pulled off flawlessly.
Hi, my name is Rachel Steinbring. I'm the design and photography lead here at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I'm going to take you through my process for designing the title wall for Americans in Spain. Once I've spent some time with the checklist in the works, I then go into mood boarding. Mood boarding is the process of gathering materials that become the visual representation of the different ideas that will become the title wall. So for this exhibition in particular, I really looked at Spanish tiles, the embroidery of a matador's jacket, really looking at the rich architectural and decorative history of Spain in the 19th and 20th centuries. From there, I work closely with the exhibition designer and the curator to start putting those ideas to paper. The first design explorations are more like sketches. They're really just an opportunity to play with different ideas, get a sense of scale, and really look at how the different elements could come together or break apart to create a title wall. For this exhibition in particular, we kept coming back to one design exploration. And it was an exploration that really mimicked the Alhambra that is represented in Sorolla's Hall of the Ambassadors, as you can see here. For that exploration, we really looked at the different archways that create the beautiful facade of the building, and then also bringing in some patterning elements that help to kind of illustrate that decorative history of Spain.
Hello, my name is Liddell Abbott-Janes, and I am the Associate Registrar for Exhibitions and Loans at the Milwaukee Art Museum. I'm standing here at the museum's loading dock, where we received the shipment for Americans in Spain. The artwork will be shipped on climate-controlled trucks and arrive at MAM in custom-made museum-quality crates. This means they are fully insulated and waterproof to protect the artwork and maintain the appropriate temperature and humidity. Once they arrive, they will be left unopened for 24 hours to allow for acclimatization. The most exciting part of my job is the installation of exhibitions. This is when we get to open the crates and see works in person that we may have only seen thumbnail images of during the years of preparation and planning that typically precede an exhibition. I coordinate and oversee the installation schedule, which can be a complex process. In the case of Americans in Spain, I will act as a liaison for nearly 50 domestic and more than a half a dozen international lenders, keeping them up to date with the progress and condition of their work. What's unique about this exhibition is that we won't be hosting couriers in person as we normally do, but instead we'll be meeting with more than a dozen couriers who will view the unpacking, inspection, and installation of their work through a virtual platform. I hope you enjoy the exhibition as much as we enjoyed putting it together for you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for making Americans in Spain such a special and unique experience. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I also want to extend an additional thanks to Lucia Marquand and Yale University Press for the wonderful catalog they helped put together, and to our catalog authors, Eugenia Afinaganova, Betsy Boone, Valerie Ann Leeds, Francesc Quile Correa, and of course, to my co-curator on the project, Corey Piper, who will be joining me later. There are a couple behind the scenes people I also have to offer a thanks to, and that is our videographer extraordinaire, Ted Bruce-Abardis, who has been doing this the whole time. Thank you, Ted. And a person who has been involved in every aspect of everything you saw in the film, working behind the scenes, and that is curatorial assistant, China Bounds. Thank you, China. Thank you, Ted. And it's appropriate that I am now standing in front of John Singer Sartre's portrait of the Spanish dancer Carmen Ducet Moreno, better known by her stage name Carmencita, because as I learned through the planning and installation of the exhibition, China can do a pretty mean interpretation of Carmencita's dance. And if you're looking at the painting by Sargent here, you can see Carmencita triumphant, almost after a command performance in front of the footlights of the stage, ready to accept her bows and roses. I encourage you to come to the galleries to see the exhibition, where of course you can see a variety of different versions of Carmencita, one directly across from me by William Merritt Chase that offers a very different view of the performance. But Carmencita's portrait and John Singer Sargent's relationship to it also points to another fascinating phenomenon about Spanish art and culture at this time. And it was not just the fascination with traveling to Spain, even the attraction of going to Madrid, to going to the Prado. It was the interest in Spanish art, culture, theater, and performance in the United States. Sargent painted this when Carmencita was doing a series of performances in New York City in 1890. And he encountered her at a famous music hall in New York, where he went to see her a couple times. One time with Beckwith, the artist you may remember in the portrait by Thomas Eakins, again, himself a fan of Spanish art, culture, and performance. And then later she gave multiple studio performances for a Sargent circle of artistic friends and collectors. And this is how he came to paint her portrait. Legend has it that Carmencita posed for Sargent, and that he was able at least to capture her likeness to a certain extent, but that William Merritt Chase had to make do with standard postcards. So never had Carmencita actually pose for him. But once you come to the galleries, you have a chance to see both. I'll let you decide who got the better end of that deal. But in the spirit of performance, let's hear a second one from Florentine Opera singer Jordan Schreiner, again accompanied by principal pianist Jana Ernst. And Jordan is going to sing an aria from a Spanish zarzuela, La Tabernera del Puerto. And in this aria, the singer is professing his love for his lover, no puede ser, meaning it cannot be so, saying that the woman that he loves, that he prayed with, could not be so wicked, could not be so evil. If it was so, then he could not live.
No puede ser, esa mujer es buena. No puede ser una mujer malvada. En su mirar, como una luz singular, él hizo que esa mujer es una desventurada. No puede ser una vulgar sirena. Los ojos que lloran no saben mentir, las malas mujeres no miran así, temblando en sus ojos dos lágrimas vi, y a mí me ilusiona que tiemblen por mí.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rachel Belmer, the Milwaukee Art Museum's Director of Membership. I'm so honored to be joining you tonight from the museum to kick off our virtual conversation with the exhibition co-curators, Brandon Ruud, the Milwaukee Art Museum's Abert Family Curator of American Art, and Corey Piper, the Brock Curator of American Art at the Chrysler Museum of Art. But before we begin, I want to thank the Florentine Opera for their beautiful and inspired performance this evening. I also want to take a moment to thank our Milwaukee Art Museum members. We are so grateful for your steadfast support, especially during this past year, and we are thrilled to celebrate this exciting moment with you this evening. On behalf of our entire Milwaukee Art Museum team, thank you for being part of our member family. And then without further ado, I am pleased to begin our conversation tonight by introducing you to our exhibition co-curators. You've already heard from Brandon Ruud already this evening, but let me tell you a little bit more about him. Brandon is the Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum. He has organized several exhibitions and their accompanying catalogs, including A Faithful and Vivid Picture, Carl Bodmer's North American Prints, Apostles of Beauty, Art and Crafts from Britain to Chicago, and Coming Away, Winslow Homer in England. Ruud also holds an MA from the Department of Art and Art History at George Washington University, and a PhD in American Art from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Corey Piper, who I'm also so pleased to welcome to the program this evening, hello Corey, has served as the Brock Curator of American Art at the Chrysler Museum of Art since 2017. His previous exhibitions, curated and co-curated, include Watercolor, An American Medium, Thomas Jefferson, Architect, and Catching Sight, The World of British Sporting Print. He earned a PhD in the History of American Art from the University of Virginia, and his writing has appeared in the Burlington Magazine, Panorama, the Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, and the British Art Journal. So I think with that, Brandon and Corey, we are ready to jump into our Q&A this evening. We did receive a number of questions in advance, which we'll start with. And then I encourage anyone joining us from home tonight to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can tonight. So I think this first question I have here is a good place to start. And I'm going to pitch this one to you, Corey. How were the items selected for this exhibition, and how long have you been planning the exhibition?
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, I'll just say hello to everyone, and thank you so much for having me, to Rachel and Brandon, and to everyone there, and congratulations on this wonderful occasion this evening. I'm so excited to be joining you tonight. And to turn to the question, the project began for me about 4 years ago in 2017, and it began actually with a conversation over dinner when Brandon was coming through town, acting as a courier, picking up a painting that we were lending to his Winslow Homer exhibition project. And so at that dinner, he gave a little glimpse of the beginnings of this project that he had been working on, and then things just kind of grew out of that partnership. So it's been, for me, 4 years. I think the genesis of the project is a little bit farther back than that. The first part of the question is a pretty complex one, but to try to sum up maybe in just a couple of minutes. You know, one of the challenges really in looking at this period is the really vast impact that the experience of travel to Spain had on American artists. And so there's really was quite a bit of material to choose from. And so one of the challenges was editing and really coming up with a checklist that told a historically relevant story, but also one that was visually compelling and presented really spectacular and significant works of art to viewers as they travel through the galleries. So from there, we were looking to construct a narrative. And I think, we looked close by first, I think, at both of our collections for the sorts of resources that we had at both institutions, which complemented each other quite well in different ways. We have sort of different strengths of the collection, which appear throughout the exhibition. But from there, we began a really extensive process of fanning out throughout the country, across the Atlantic to Europe, to research and look into different collections, to meet with curators and directors and private collectors, to research their works and to make our case for why they were so important to include in the exhibition. So the process included a bit of negotiation as well. And I have to say, we were very lucky to have many very generous lenders to the exhibition, because these are works from major collections that are really major masterpieces and centers of other people's collections. So we're very fortunate that they were generously willing to share them with us.
Thank you, Corey. So we have another question here, which ties nicely to sort of what you were describing. And Brandon, maybe you can take this one. What were the challenges of organizing an exhibition during this period? And how did you prepare and research for an exhibition on Spain as borders were beginning to close for the pandemic?
A great question. It's interesting because, as Corey mentioned at the beginning, we had started this project together with Chrysler about 4 years ago for the Milwaukee Art Museum. It was a little bit before that. About 5 years ago, thinking and planning with some of our collaborators I mentioned, Eugenia Afiniganova at Marquette University, thinking about the resources at the American Geographical Society Library at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, those sorts of things. And so a lot of the checklist, a lot of the research was done before February and March of last year, when the pandemic really began to shut things down. So it was a matter of rescheduling and the production of the catalog. The production of the catalog was a little tricky because, of course, we were wondering if many of the lenders were going to step up, still make their objects, these great masterpieces, available. And so lucky, as Corey mentioned, that yes, they were all really solid in their support for the project and the two museums. And so the catalog went into production, and I think it was more the coordination of the loans. As Liddell mentioned in her video, working with virtual couriers rather than scheduling things on site, an experience I know Corey and all of them had at Chrysler as well, and coordinating all of the logistics about getting the artwork here, first of all, to the United States or in each individual city. And then the research and the planning, it was interesting because the last time I was in Spain was when things began to go down on lockdown, and that was doing some color proofing for the catalog, as well as some final research. So in a way, it did kind of affect the final plans for the exhibition, for the catalog. But really, I just have to say how truly appreciative I am of my colleagues, the sister institutions, who really, during challenging circumstances, parted with their masterpieces to let the show continue and happen.
Thank you. And can you tell us, why did you choose the years 1820 through 1920 for the Americans in Spain exhibition?
You want to go, Corey? Do you want me to?
Sure, I can dive into that one. There's a number of reasons. One is a practical reason, that you have to bracket things somewhere, that you have to define things in a certain way. But it was kind of a logical time period that related to the material presented in the show. At the beginning, this was a period not when many American travelers were venturing to Spain, but their British predecessors, British artistic travelers. So one section of the exhibition looks at this early history of artistic travelers, British artists like David Roberts and David Wilkie, who were traveling in the late 1820s or 1830s. But also you begin to have in the 1820s a particularly important figure traveling in Spain, and that's Washington Irving, the writer who publishes a very important book, The Tales of the Alhambra, very early in this period in 1832. And so you have this sort of beginning bracket, and there's also the nationalization of the Prado Museum as an important milestone at the beginning of that story in 1819. And then at the latter end, you have the period, the kind of great maybe flourishing of American artistic interest in Spain is really, I would say, from about the period of 1870 up until 1920. And then you have American artists begin to disengage a little bit with the country after that. I think some important figures like Robert Henry, who makes the most trips to Spain, 7 trips to Spain total. But I think the last time he goes there is 1924, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon. And so you have artists just begin to look in different directions. So it was a kind of natural conclusion to this story that we're trying to tell within the exhibition.
Yeah, very good, Corey. It was 1926, so only 2 years. No, but Corey's absolutely right. People, even as I mentioned in the introduction, there was this fascination with Spain. We bracketed it in 100 years this century, and at first the obsession was with Murillo, and then it became Velázquez, and then certainly by the outbreak of World War I, and then the conclusion by 1918, artists had become fascinated with other modes of expression, the studios of Paris, of modernism, all of these other things. And there's still quite a fascinating story about American involvement, artistic and cultural involvement in Spain after 1920, but it's also a very different story.
And Brandon, could you talk a little bit more about what you think attracted so many American artists to Spain during that period?
Yeah, that's another really good question, because I think in many ways it was just kind of accumulation of building. Spain, as I mentioned in the introduction, began to nationalize its collections, began to open museums to the public in the first decades of the 19th century. And then, as Corey said, these British artists were the first to mainly depict Spain. They did so in these lavish portfolios and these travel guides and narratives. These were disseminated widely. People began to read books. Washington Irving, the famous American author, his great success and first claim to fame was through his book on Spain. And this led to then many of his other publications. And so there were all of these great connections. And then by the time collectors became interested in Spanish art, you began to see them enter Spain, or rather exit Spain and go to other countries, into museum and private and personal collections. Artists became more familiar because there was that close relationship between artist and collector. And then probably the fad of it. Oh, I've been to Spain, I've been to Madrid, I've been to the Prado. It was kind of a badge of honor going through the galleries again, showing some of those copies, these hanging in their studios. You'll see several self-portraits or portraits of others throughout the galleries in the exhibition, where the artist depicted himself in the guise of a Velázquez subject or sitter, or they painted a self-portrait of herself with a portrait of Pablo de Valladolid, a famous Velázquez subject, or another painting by a Spanish master in the background. It kind of became this badge of honor, if you will, this way of bragging that you had been to Spain, you had been to Prado, you had copied master works at the Prado Museum. So I think then it kind of snowballed. And then, as Corey mentioned with the other question, by the turn of the century, when you get into the 1920s, modes of expression and fads changed.
All right, we have another question here that asks, which Spanish artists have been a revelation for the American public?
Well, I don't know if I can speak for the whole American public, perhaps, but I think there are there's some figures in the exhibition that might be surprising a little bit to people, I hope. At least that's what I found when the paintings were displayed here. And I think first and foremost for me was Ignacio Zuloaga, a Spanish painter of the early 20th century. And I didn't see it in the background of Brandon's walkthrough, but I saw a very tantalizing glimpse in the model there of how it's presented. It's oh, we're maybe about to get a little look here. It's a monumental painting that's spectacular, overwhelming, strange, and all the really things you would love for really powerful, gripping painting. And he's a figure that's not unknown. It's not a completely unknown name, particularly in if you're studying Spanish modernism. He's a major pivotal figure, but not someone I think that you encounter very frequently in, at least in American museums, in telling the history of modernism, but really an important figure to this story of the American fascination with Spain, because during the early decades of the 20th century, he was a phenomenally popular artist whose work traveled throughout the United States, who was, shown in really popular exhibitions that people lined up, sponsored by the Hispanic Society of America. So certainly I think that's an artist. It's a painting you cannot possibly miss, and one that I think it's presented at, I think towards the end of the exhibition, and certainly leaves you gobsmacked as you walk out the door of the exhibition.
No, I think Corey's absolutely right. And apologies to Ted, because of course my skills are nowhere as good as his, but it is a really dramatic painting and a great way to end the exhibition. Corey's absolutely right. I think it'll be a revelation to many visitors from the United States. And I would add to that even someone like Sorolla, who was so hugely popular at the turn of the century and friends with Chase and John Singer Sargent and all these artists. And even Mariano Fortuny, all of whom you see in the exhibition, another hugely popular artist in the 19th century, and popular with both artists and collectors, but not quite as familiar with American audiences today.
All right, so we have another two-part question here. And Brandon, you kind of touched a little bit on this already, but how did the practice of copying old master paintings as a way to learn to paint begin? And then they follow up with asking, were these paintings produced to be sold to the residents and or tourists?
Oh gosh, another really good question. On the origins of copying, I couldn't say honestly for sure when the first artist made the first copy, or when the first class was asked to make copies, but this was a pretty standard practice with the formation of art academies. So certainly by the 18th century, then especially in the 19th century. So copying from live models, and then copying other artists' work, other paintings. The practice, especially by the 19th century, really took off. I think with the institution, not only of the academies, but of museums, as artists could go to other locations, they could go to other museums, they could see these masterworks, they could go ahead and copy them, they can paint them, and they were encouraged to do so by their teachers, by their instructors. So it really did become a standard form of practice during the 19th century. In terms of saleability, they were not typically for sale. As kind of mentioned in the introduction, our conversation here, they really acted as models for the artists. They would use them for inspiration, to create another composition. And they also had kind of those bragging rights. Again, it's amazing looking at the paintings and the objects in the show, how many of them have like you, Rachel, and the position you're sitting in, these paintings from the Prado in the background, kind of, again, is a way to brag, look where I've been, look what I've copied, look what I own. And occasionally there were exhibitions of some of the copies these artists made, and you would see them in museums, but largely they were for the benefit of the artist. So I hope that captured it.
Thank you. We have another question here coming in from one of our live viewers tonight. And that question is there much written material available on the 3 American women exhibited besides Mary Cassatt?
I can jump in on that one. The short answer is there's not a great deal. That their stories have not been extensively written, and as well as Mary Cassatt. Their time is not as well documented in the country. Certainly they produced fantastic works of art. These other artists, Mary Bradish Titcomb, Elizabeth Boot, Carrie Hill, these are artists that certainly their biographies are written in other sources, and you can find sources on these artists, but the story of their time in Spain is a little bit less documented and told. That's not to say there are some other really interesting scholarships, certainly on the experience of women traveling in Spain. I would say first and foremost in our catalog, Betsy Boone's essay about the literature of travel to Spain, about young people traveling, and particularly young women, these travel books that were written aimed to a young female 19th century audience. So the short answer is there's not a great deal. There remains a lot of work to be done. I don't know if Brandon has other sources that you can point to.
No, I think that's no, I think you pretty much captured it. Of course, Mary Cassatt, almost endless, any number of things written about her. Carrie Hill, there is actually a very good book on Southern women artists, because she was from Alabama, where there are some good chapters on her and her visits to Spain, as well as to North Africa and other places she went to. Marjorie Organ Henry, of course, you're largely going to see in reference to Robert Henry, but there's some sources out there on her as well. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Mary Bradish Titcomb or Lizzie Boot. Maybe a little bit, certainly more needs to be done, but I have my own theory about Lizzie Boot maybe never really having traveled to Spain and making the watercolor in the exhibition from a copy of a photograph, but I'll leave that for another time. So.
All right, and I think we have time for just one more question here, and we have another one that asks, how do the artists sign their copy of a masterwork?
You want me to take this one, Corey? Start.
Sure, yeah.
in a variety of different eccentric ways, in sometimes grand ways. We were just looking at the signature of Fortuny painting in the gallery earlier, and there's this very kind of elaborate, almost stamp-like quality to the signature. Sometimes you'll see them very bold, the artist announcing herself, if you will, in many ways. In other ways, it may be more subtle. Again, many of the copies, because they were never intended to be displayed or as collectible items, would be unsigned at all. Someone you have like Robert Henry, and you can see the legs of his Matador right behind me, was so thorough about documenting everything he signed, dated, wrote the title on the back of the canvas, but also in all his journals. So there's any number of ways, from the very grand and excessive to the very kind of subtle and humble. And Corey, please.
Yeah, I think it varies as many different ways as different artists there are. And I'll say that, it can be very difficult unless the sort of provenance of these works are well documented. There were a lot of these types of copies being produced in the 19th century, so it can be very easy to kind of lose track. And part of the goal is to recreate the old master rather than your own sort of creative impulse. And so, yeah, those sorts of signatures and those little detective pieces to piece it back together become very important.
Well, Brandon and Corey, thank you both so much for taking us on this wonderful journey to Spain this evening. It's been lovely. And also thank you to all the members who are joining us and our special guests who are joining us as well from home. It's been great celebrating with you tonight. And if you have not already come to see these remarkable works in person, we hope that we will see you in the galleries very soon. So take care and thanks everyone.
Thank you, everybody.